Hello folks, and welcome back to another case study where I discuss and analyze some of the strangest national park disappearances out there. In this segment, I'll be addressing a case so bizarre, it'll make your head spin. Ever since I first came across it, this one has always intrigued me for being one of the strangest out there. And that involves the disappearance of a 30-year-old hiker who seemed to have vanished into thin air while hiking at the upper Yosemite Falls region of Yosemite National Park. For this young man, there was really nowhere to go but down, and he was surrounded by many others at the time he went missing. This case bothered folks so much that some went so far as to state that it's as if he was never even there. And we've heard this before in many other cases, which is why I decided to cover it. So let's begin. On Friday, June 11th of 2011, 30-year-old George Penca went hiking with a church group of 80 members, of which 20 had been hiking the upper Yosemite Falls trail that day. The main group separated somewhere at the beginning of the trail, with one staying around the base and the others continuing to the top. And when they reached the end of the trail and the lookout point, they all came back at their own pace, except for George. At some point, it was noted that George fell slightly behind the group, putting him in the back of the line. When the hikers returned to Yosemite Valley floor, they all regrouped, and it was then they realized that George was missing, and they reported it to park officials. Before we get into the specifics about his disappearance and who he was, I'd like to describe the area where the group had been hiking and where George eventually went missing. According to the National Park website, Yosemite Falls is one of the oldest historic falls in the U.S. and leads to the top of North America's tallest waterfall, which rises 2,400 feet above the valley floor. The 3-mile trail begins near Camp 4 along the Valley Loop Trail and immediately begins its climb through oak forests. The climb offers stunning views of Yosemite Valley and other iconic landforms like Half Dome and the Lean-To area. However, straying off the maintained path can put you in immediate danger, as one side drops substantially adjacent to the trail, while the other is quite steep and rocky. For the average visitor, it can be an arduous climb, but the reward is often worth it. So let's talk a little bit about George and who he was and why he was there. George was from Hawthorne, California, and traveled with his church to the park for a day's hike. George had some medical issues that would prevent him from hiking for too long and too far, and although I was unable to find specifics for this, he wasn't in the best physical shape in general. At the time of his disappearance, he weighed around 250 pounds and was approximately 5'10". He had dark brown hair, blue eyes, and a stocky build. He was last seen wearing gray sweatpants with white stripes, a black t-shirt that says D&B across the chest, and gray/blue running shoes. He was carrying a blue cloth bag and had very little food and water on him. In fact, the 2 photos you see of him in this video were taken on the exact same day he disappeared. The church members who last saw him stated that nothing appeared out of ordinary and that George was in good spirits and, surprisingly, had no issues making it up that trail despite his health issues. So let's get into the search. That Friday night, the same day he went missing, the initial search began. A full-scale search operation kicked off, including around 150 search and rescue personnel, 2 choppers, several dog teams, and 14 California County search and rescue teams from surrounding counties. This search included 70 square miles of rugged terrain, ranging in elevation from 4,000 feet above sea level to around 8,000. After 3 days of intense work, the search implemented a change in strategy due to the lack of clues to George's whereabouts and increasingly bad weather. About a week after his disappearance on June 17th, search efforts transitioned to a limited continuous search, and after another week, it was suspended altogether, though a handful of volunteers kept searching for the next couple weeks. The search was listed as one of the largest searches in the park's history, using more time, funding, and manpower than any other disappearance since the Stacey Harris case in the early 80s. I like to mention that weather conditions were described as next to perfect on the day George disappeared, with sunny skies and mild weekend temperatures ranging from the upper 40s at night to early 70s in the day. So in the last several years, no trace of George has turned up, and if you include the massive search involved, it makes this case even more perplexing. There should have been some evidence of him located, but nothing. No clothes, no bag, no remains, no eyewitnesses. Let's go ahead and switch gears now and discuss some theories about what may have happened to George out there on that trail. As I mentioned earlier, Upper Yosemite Falls rises approximately 2,500 to 3,000 feet at the peak, and depending on the exact point of the 3-mile trek, one side of the trail is lined with a guardrail that separates the hikers from a sheer drop-off hundreds of feet below, and on the other side, a granite wall that extends straight up. At various points along the trail, there are pockets of brush and the occasional tree. At other points, there are piles of large boulders. So we know that George was last seen at the end of the trail near the very top. This is the point where hikers would have turned around and headed back. Now George was at the back of the group as they began heading back, and from what I read, there were no other hikers behind George until later on that day when other groups began filtering into the area. But from what we know, George was the last one out there for a certain length of time. Now, given the terrain, there was nowhere for George to go but down. So I think most of us would assume that there were 3 likely options as to what happened to George. The first one is, he went off the side of those falls. As to how and why is a completely different story. Given all the resources and manpower utilized in the search and rescue effort, you would think they would have spotted something looking down from above. But is it possible he fell and disappeared into a rocky void? Were there trees or brush obscuring the searchers' views? We also know that climbers were utilized, and they descended down these areas and systematically searched the entire face of the wall, and essentially left no rock unturned, from what reports stated. So if he didn't end up falling below, then our next theory pops up. Even though the trail ended at that lookout point, there are certain areas where the rocks continued up, and eventually over that area, leading to extremely steep and rugged terrain on the other side. We know that George was not in the best shape, but is it possible that he could have went further up for some reason? Could he have scaled those rocks and made it to the other side, disappearing over him? This scenario is hard to imagine given the circumstances. So the only other explanation left is that he was never up there to begin with, and disappeared somewhere else along that 3-mile trail. Is it possible his fellow church members assumed that George was with them? Did they mistake somebody else for him or lost count of him? It's not hard to imagine considering the size of the group. Is it possible that when the group split up, that each one assumed that George had been with the other? Did he wander off the trail to perhaps relieve himself and had gotten lost? Did he run into a potential predator, or was he kidnapped for some reason and taken out of the park? Given the facts in these cases and the complete lack of evidence, it's hard to imagine any of these situations holding any weight. But we can't help but rule out that searchers may have overlooked an important detail. After all, nothing is 100% effective, and many others have vanished in that park as well, never to be found. But I believe the answer to his disappearance is still out there on that trail. And perhaps one day, maybe some evidence will come forward supporting this theory. What do you all think? I'd like to hear from you. Thanks for joining me on this case, and may we never forget the sad and strange disappearance of George Penca.